The moment Beatrice Bristol stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, with nothing but a leather satchel, a loaded derringer tucked into her boot, and a stubborn set to her jaw, every man on the main street stopped what he was doing and stared. She paid them no mind. It was the summer of 1878, and the cattle town of Caldwell sat just north of the Kansas Indian Territory border like a nail driven into the prairie, rough and functional, and utterly indifferent to the tender feelings of anyone who happened to pass through. The air smelled of cattle dust, horse sweat, and the faint sweetness of prairie grass baking under a relentless July sun. Wooden storefronts lined the main street with their false fronts reaching up like they were trying to scrape the pale blue sky. The Long Branch Saloon sat across from the general store, and from somewhere inside it, a piano played a tune that was slightly out of key but cheerful enough to make the effort count. Beatrice stood on the boardwalk, let the stagecoach pull away behind her, and consulted the letter she had folded and refolded so many times that the creases were soft as cloth. The letter was from a man named Gerald Hooper, who had advertised in the Chicago Tribune for a woman with bookkeeping experience to manage the accounts of his dry goods business. He had been specific about wanting someone professional, organized, and capable of working independently. He had not mentioned anything about marriage, which was precisely why Beatrice had answered the advertisement. She had left Chicago 3 weeks prior with the last of her savings and a determined refusal to look backward. Her father had died in the spring, leaving behind a stack of debts that swallowed the family home whole. Her older brother had taken what was left and emigrated to New York, leaving Beatrice with a practical education, a facility with numbers that bordered on preternatural, and absolutely no intention of solving her problems by attaching herself to a man. She had seen what that looked like. She had watched her mother bend herself smaller and smaller to fit inside a marriage that did not leave room for the full version of her, until the day her mother died, and even then, the funeral had been organized around what suited her father's schedule. Beatrice had decided at the age of 14 that she would rather face the world alone and intact than shrink herself to fit someone else's expectation. So she was in Caldwell, Kansas, with a job offer and no romantic illusions, and she intended to keep it that way. Gerald Hooper's dry goods store was at the far end of the main street, a wide-fronted building with a sign that read Hooper's Mercantile in faded red letters. When Beatrice pushed open the door, a bell above the frame rang its announcement, and a man behind the counter looked up from a ledger with an expression that cycled rapidly through surprise, appreciation, and then something that made Beatrice's spine stiffen with recognition. Miss Bristol. Gerald Hooper was about 50 years old, wide through the middle, with a graying mustache and small eyes that moved over her with a particular kind of calculation she had seen before on the faces of men who believed a woman's practical usefulness and her availability were the same subject. "Well, you are a surprise. I am exactly who you hired," Beatrice said pleasantly, setting her satchel on the counter. "I brought my references and a sample of my work from the Alderman Brothers accounting firm in Chicago, where I worked for 4 years. Shall we begin with the current state of your accounts receivable, or would you prefer to start with inventory?" Gerald Hooper blinked. Then he leaned on the counter and smiled in a way that did not reach his eyes. "I was thinking we might have supper first, get acquainted." "I have already eaten," Beatrice said, which was a lie but a useful one. "I am very eager to begin work. The advertisement said the position was immediate. I would hate to waste your time or mine." The afternoon that followed was instructive. Beatrice sat behind the counter with the account books spread before her, and understood within 20 minutes that Gerald Hooper's books were a catastrophe of optimistic guesswork and selective memory. He had been undercharging his regular customers and overcharging strangers, tracking neither consistently, and he had 3 suppliers to whom he owed money that had not been recorded anywhere in the ledger. It would take her 2 weeks to sort it into anything resembling order. What became clear by the end of that first afternoon was something else. Gerald Hooper came to stand behind her 3 separate times to look over her shoulder, each time finding a reason to let his hand rest briefly on the back of her chair, or to lean in close enough that she could smell the whiskey he had been drinking since noon. He told her twice that a woman alone in a cattle town needed someone to look after her. He mentioned that the hotel where she planned to board was not entirely respectable. On the third occurrence, Beatrice put down her pen, turned in her chair, and looked at him with a directness that made him step back. "Mr. Hooper," she said, "I came here to do a job. I am good at this job, and your books need someone who is good at it. I'm not here for any other purpose. I would appreciate if we could keep our professional arrangement exactly that." He studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded, smiling the smile that did not reach his eyes, and said he would see her in the morning. Beatrice gathered her things, picked up her satchel, and walked out into the golden late afternoon, where the street was busy with the returning energy of cowboys driving their cattle from the trail and merchants closing up for the day. She stood on the boardwalk and exhaled slowly. She would manage Gerald Hooper. She had managed men like him before. What she needed first was supper, because she had in fact not eaten since the stagecoach stop in Wichita, and the world looked considerably more manageable on a full stomach. The restaurant attached to the Caldwell Hotel was called simply the dining room, which Beatrice appreciated for its honesty. She pushed open the door and was shown to a small table near the window, where she ordered the beef stew and a pot of coffee, and she spread the Hooper account books on the table beside her plate, because she was that kind of woman and had stopped apologizing for it some time ago. She was halfway through both the stew and a particularly maddening discrepancy in the August accounts when the chair across from her was pulled out without invitation, and a man sat down in it. Beatrice looked up, prepared to deliver a remark that would send him promptly back to wherever he came from. The man across from her was in his early 30s, leaned through the shoulders in the way that spoke of real work rather than fashionable exercise, with dark hair that needed cutting and steady brown eyes that were watching her with an expression that was more curious than presumptuous. He wore a trail-worn canvas jacket, working man's trousers, and boots that had seen the better part of the Kisham Trail. His hat was in his hand, which she noted because most men forgot to take it off indoors. "That seat is taken," she said. "I know," he said. "I took it, Robert Wells." He did not extend his hand, which she also noted. "I apologize for sitting down without asking. The place is full, and the owner, Mrs. Kimball, told me you would not mind sharing if I asked politely." Beatrice glanced around the small room and confirmed that it was indeed full, every other table occupied by trail hands and merchants and a group of buffalo hunters who smelled powerfully of their occupation. "You have not yet asked politely," she said. Something shifted in the corner of his mouth. "May I share your table, Miss Bristol? Beatrice Bristol." She looked back at her account book. "You may sit." He sat. He ordered coffee and the stew from a passing girl without making a fuss about the menu, and then he looked out the window at the street with the settled patience of a man who was comfortable in his own silence. Beatrice waited for the inevitable follow-up. The question about where she was from, what she was doing here, why a woman like her was sitting alone in a restaurant in Caldwell. She had her answers ready, efficient, and discouraging. Robert Wells said nothing. He drank his coffee. He ate his stew when it came. He watched the street. After 20 minutes of this, Beatrice found herself unsettled in a way she had not anticipated. She looked up from her accounts. "You are not curious about what I am doing here." "I am," he said, "but it is your business." She studied him. Most men would have asked by now. Most men have not learned yet that a woman doing arithmetic at a supper table probably does not want to be interrupted. Beatrice looked at him for another moment, then back at her books, but the numbers had lost some of their sharp urgency. "I am the new bookkeeper for Hooper's Mercantile," she said, because the silence had become something different from what she was used to and she was processing it. "I arrived today from Chicago. Long way to come for a job. It was the right job." He nodded as though that made complete sense. "Drove cattle up from Texas. Dunbar outfit about 800 head. We arrived this morning too. Is the cattle business good? Good enough this year. He tilted his head slightly, looking out at the street where three of his fellow cowboys were currently engaged in a spirited argument about something outside the window. Crowded on the trails, and the Kansas farmers are putting up fences, so the drives are getting shorter and harder every year. The railroad's changing things, but this year was good enough. You have been on the trail long. About 4 months. Texas to here. He said it simply, without complaint or drama, the way someone describes work they understand and accept. Beatrice thought about 4 months on the open trail, sleeping on the ground, eating camp cooking, managing 800 animals in every variety of Kansas weather, and she found herself genuinely curious about what that life looked like from the inside. She was curious about most things. It was one of her better qualities. They talked for another half-hour, which surprised her considerably, because she had not planned to talk to anyone at supper. He told her about the drive with the straightforward storytelling of a man who did not embellish for effect, and she found herself following the narrative of the river crossings, and the storms, and the way the cattle moved at night with the fascination she usually reserved for a complicated ledger that was beginning to make sense. When she finally closed her account book and set down her coffee cup, the restaurant had thinned to just a few occupied tables. "I appreciate the company," she said, with a formality that she recognized was slightly excessive for the casual warmth of the conversation they had just had. "And the table. The pleasure was mine, Miss Bristol." He rose when she did, which was old-fashioned courtesy that she did not expect from a trail cowboy in a Kansas cattle town. "If you are staying at the Caldwell Hotel, I should mention that the second-floor rooms on the south side are quieter. The north side faces the street, and Friday nights are loud. I will keep that in mind." She walked back to the hotel in the warm summer evening, past groups of cowboys celebrating the end of the drive, past the lit windows of the saloon, where the piano was no longer out of tune, because enough whiskey had been consumed that nobody cared, past the general store and the land office, and the small white building that served as both the sheriff's office and the jail. She thought about Robert Wells's brown eyes, and then she thought about her account books, and then she went to her room on the south side of the second floor, which was indeed quieter, and she opened her window to let in the prairie night air, and she did not think about him again until morning. Morning brought Gerald Hooper in a more carefully pressed shirt than the day before, and a demeanor that had corrected itself overnight into something more professionally appropriate. Beatrice was already behind the counter when he arrived, the account books open, a fresh page of notes beside them. He looked at what she had accomplished, and then looked at her with something that was almost respect, and the morning went better than she had feared. By the end of the first week, she had imposed order on 6 months of Hooper's chaotic record-keeping, identified the 3 unpaid suppliers, and drafted a payment schedule that would settle the debts within 60 days without crippling the daily operation of the store. Hooper was not enthusiastic about paying the debts, but the numbers she showed him made the argument irresistible, which was the satisfying thing about numbers. They did not negotiate with sentiment. She had also, over the course of that week, developed a tentative familiarity with the town of Caldwell itself. It was a rough place, but not without character. The cattle drives brought money and men, and the businesses that served them ranged from the practical to the frankly scandalous, and the whole enterprise had the quality of a place that knew it was temporary and had decided to be enthusiastic about it anyway. The railroad was pushing south and west, and everyone knew that within a few years the cattle drives would take different routes, or end entirely, and Caldwell would have to decide what it wanted to be without them. She met the other women in the town with something approaching careful respect on both sides. There was Mrs. Eliza Kimball, who ran the hotel and restaurant with the competent authority of a woman who had built something entirely her own. There was Mrs. Dorothy Graves, who ran the schoolhouse and had the reputation of being the most educated person in town regardless of gender. And there was Agnes Whitmore, who was 22 years old and worked as a seamstress and had a sharp wit that Beatrice liked immediately. "You met Robert Wells," Agnes said on Beatrice's fourth day in town, over coffee at the hotel restaurant. Agnes said it the way people say things they know will be interesting. "Briefly," Beatrice said. "We shared a table." "He is a good man," Agnes said, in a tone that Beatrice recognized as the preamble to matchmaking, which she immediately moved to foreclose. "He seemed pleasant. I am not in the market for a husband, Agnes. I have made my peace with that." Agnes looked at her with the particular expression of someone who finds your position interesting rather than final. "He is not the type who pushes himself where he is not wanted, nothing like Hooper." She said Hooper's name with a delicate lift of her eyebrow that communicated volumes. "You want to watch Gerald Hooper, Beatrice. He has a habit of convincing himself that persistence is charm." "I have already discouraged his persistence," Beatrice said. "Good, keep discouraging it." Beatrice ran into Robert Wells on the following Tuesday, not at the hotel restaurant but at the livery stable, where she had gone to inquire about renting a horse for Sunday mornings. She had ridden since childhood and missed it, and the open land around Caldwell called to her in a way she had not expected from a place she had come to purely for work. He was in the stable yard brushing down a roan horse with the methodical, affectionate attention that told her the horse was his own rather than the outfit's. "Miss Bristol," he said, looking up. "Mr. Wells." She studied the horse. "That is a handsome animal. His name is Prospect." He ran a hand down the horse's neck. "He has walked the Kisham Trail 6 times and he will tell you about every single one if you give him half the chance." Beatrice stepped closer and let the horse sniff her hand, then stroked his nose when he accepted her. "6 drives, you have been doing this a long time." 10 years, Robert said. "Started when I was 22. She did the arithmetic without thinking. 32 then. "Do you intend to do it much longer?" He considered this with the seriousness the question deserved. "I have some land," he said. "Small piece, southeast of here in the Cherokee Strip. Not much yet, but I have been adding to it when the drives pay well. Eventually it will be enough to run my own small operation. Maybe 3-4 years. A ranch of your own. That is the idea." She liked the clarity of it. A man with a plan he was executing steadily, without drama or desperation, was a comprehensible thing. She spent so much of her professional life correcting the records of men who had made grand plans without the patience to execute them consistently that it was refreshing to encounter the opposite. "I am looking to rent a horse on Sunday mornings," she said, returning to her errand. "Do you know if Mr. Garrett is reasonable with his prices?" "Reasonable enough. Tell him I sent you. He will give you old Clara, who is gentle but has opinions about the pace you keep. Or he might give you Murphy, who has no opinions but can be startled by jackrabbits." "I will take Clara," Beatrice said, with the decisiveness she brought to most choices. He smiled at that. It was a full smile this time, the kind that reached his eyes and changed the whole landscape of his face, and Beatrice felt something shift slightly in her chest that she carefully filed away under irrelevant information. The weeks moved forward with the purposeful efficiency Beatrice brought to everything she undertook. The Hooper accounts were approaching order. The town was learning her edges. She had established herself as someone to be respected rather than managed, and the men who came into the store had mostly adjusted their initial assessments to something she found acceptable. Gerald Hooper was the continuing problem. He had restrained himself professionally, but he had not abandoned his interest, and twice in the second week he had found reasons to follow the thread of the conversation toward her personal situation, her boarding arrangements, whether she was comfortable, whether she might want company. The third time he raised the subject of her comfort in his particular tone, Beatrice set down her pen and addressed him with the directness she reserved for important things. "Mr. Hooper, I am going to say something clearly, and I would like you to hear it clearly so that we do not have to revisit it." She met his eyes steadily. "I am not looking for a husband. I am not looking for a suitor, a protector, or a companion. I came here to do work that I am exceptionally good at, and I intend to do it and to conduct my life as I see fit, which is entirely my own business. I hope that we can continue to have a professional relationship, because I believe I am genuinely improving your financial situation. But I need you to understand that the personal interest you have been indicating is not something I reciprocate, and I would be grateful if you would stop indicating it. Gerald Hooper's face went through several expressions before settling on something that was half wounded and half determined, and Beatrice knew that it had not worked entirely, but that it had at least purchased some time. What she did not anticipate was that he would take his wounded feeling to the Long Branch saloon that evening and complain about her to whoever would listen, which included a group of his fellow merchants, and that one of those merchants would be indiscreet enough to tell his wife, who told Agnes Whitmore, who came to find Beatrice the very next morning with the intelligence. "He said you were ungrateful," Agnes reported, over the counter of the mercantile, while Hooper was conveniently absent on a supply run. "He said he had brought you all the way from Chicago, which is not true. You came of your own accord, and that you were too proud for your own good." "I am exactly proud enough for my own good," Beatrice said without looking up from the ledger. "And men who confuse professional courtesy with personal invitation have a skewed sense of gratitude." "He is also saying that the job might not last," Agnes said more carefully, "that he might not need a bookkeeper after all." Beatrice stopped writing. She set down her pen and thought about this for a moment with the deliberate calm she brought to problems. She had been in Caldwell for 3 weeks. Her savings were not zero, but they were not generous. If Hooper dismissed her before she could find another position, she would be in difficulty. "Cannot dismiss me without cause," she said, because she had been careful to get that in the letter of agreement before she came. "I have his signed agreement in my satchel. He might make things difficult enough that you choose to leave." "I have encountered difficult before," Beatrice said. "I will manage Gerald Hooper." She was walking back to the hotel that evening, still turning the problem in her mind, when Robert Wells fell into step beside her on the boardwalk. He did not appear from anywhere alarming. He had simply been coming the other direction, had recognized her, and had turned to walk the same direction she was walking. "You look like you are solving a problem," he said. "I am." She considered whether to say more, and then, because he was easy to talk to in a way she had not found with many people, she said, "Gerald Hooper is making noise about ending my employment." His expression shifted. "Because of the bookkeeping. Because I will not entertain his personal interest." Robert Wells was quiet for a moment. They walked past the land office and the barber shop and a group of cowboys who parted for them with cheerful efficiency. "That is wrong of him," he said, in a tone that was simple and final without the quality of someone performing outrage for her benefit. "Yes, it is. What will you do?" "I am considering my options." She paused. "I have done enough work on those books that I could make the case to any judge or magistrate that my work has been valuable, if he tries to cancel the agreement without cause. I also know enough about the state of his accounts to understand that he cannot actually afford to lose me right now. He owes Pendleton Goods in St. Louis $240, and he owes Riley's in Kansas City $112. If those creditors call those debts, which they will eventually, he needs someone who can manage the repayment schedule I have built, because without it he will lose the store." Robert looked at her with an expression she could not immediately classify. It was somewhere between admiration and amusement. "You went in knowing you would have leverage. I went in to do a job. The leverage is a consequence of doing it well." She paused. "But yes, I understand that in a world where I have fewer formal protections than I ought to have, understanding the practical realities of a situation is the most useful tool I have. That is a smart way to think about it. It is the only way I can afford to think about it." He was quiet again in the easy way he had, and they walked another half-block before he said, "There is a social at the Methodist Church on Saturday. Mrs. Kimball organizes it. Food is good, people are decent, and it is a reasonable way to spend an evening." She looked at him. "Are you inviting me to a social, Mr. Wells? I am mentioning that there is one, he said, and there was that fractional shift at the corner of his mouth again. You can interpret that how you like. I see. I will be there, he said simply. You would not be obligated to spend any part of the evening in my company if you did not choose to. Beatrice thought about this for the remaining block to the hotel. At the door, she turned and said, "It is a church social. I imagine the conversation will be supervised." "Rigorously," he agreed. "Then I will consider it." She went to the social, because Agnes dragged her there with the cheerful persistence of a woman on a mission she had not been asked to undertake, and because Beatrice had spent enough evenings alone with Hooper's account books that a social was genuinely appealing. The Methodist church hall was lit with lanterns and smelled of pine wood and the extraordinary collection of food that the women of Caldwell had produced, because whatever else the frontier lacked, it did not lack the determination to make a good table at a community gathering. There were pies and baked beans and cornbread and roasted chickens and a bowl of punch that Mrs. Kimball had made from a recipe that contained exactly enough whiskey to make it interesting without making it scandalous, which Beatrice thought was a very refined line to walk. Robert Wells was there. He was talking to two other cowboys near the punch bowl when she arrived, and he looked over at her entry with the contained attention she was beginning to recognize as particular to him, the way he looked at things, as though he was seeing them completely rather than selecting the parts that were convenient. He crossed to where she was standing with Agnes and he said, "Miss Bristol, I am glad you could come." And then he turned to Agnes and said, "Agnes, that pie you brought last time was the best apple pie I have eaten in 10 years of trail cooking." And Agnes turned pink with pleasure and went to get them both cups of punch, leaving them together, which Beatrice suspected was entirely intentional. They stood at the edge of the room together and watched the social unfold around them, the children running between adult legs, the older men comparing the summer's cattle prices, the women managing the food and the general orchestration of everything, and Beatrice found herself relaxing by degrees, the way she did when a situation proved to be consistently what it appeared to be. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask me anything," Robert said. "I might not answer, but you can ask." She liked that as a response. It was honest without being evasive. "Why did you come to Caldwell? I know the drive ended here, but you told me about the land in the Cherokee Strip. Why not settle there? I wanted to see this year through first. The drive pays well enough that by the time the Dunbar outfit settles accounts, I will have enough to buy the additional 40 acres I need to make the spread workable." He looked out at the room. "It makes sense to stay one more season. And after that, no more drives. After that, I am done with trail work." He said it without regret, which told her it was a decision fully made. "I like the land. I want to wake up in one place." She understood that instinctively, even though her own relationship with place was more complicated. She had grown up in Chicago in the same house until the bank took it, and she had thought she would always want the city, but 3 weeks in Caldwell had shown her something she had not expected, which was that the open land, the enormous sky, the particular silence of the prairie in the early morning, called to something in her that Chicago had kept quiet. "Tell me about the land," she said. "Your 40 acres. His eyes lit in the way people's eyes light when you ask them about the thing they care about most. And for the next hour, standing at the edge of a church social in Caldwell, Kansas, in August of 1878, Beatrice Bristol listened to Robert Wells describe a piece of the Cherokee Strip that he had seen once in the early spring when the grass was coming up green, and the sky was the particular color it gets before a storm, and she felt something she had been careful not to feel for a very long time. She felt interest. Not the professional interest she brought to account books and practical problems, but the kind of interest that makes a person lean slightly forward without noticing they have done it. She noticed. She stepped back to a careful distance and told herself it was the punch. The next morning, Gerald Hooper called her into the back room of the store and told her that he had decided the bookkeeping position was permanent. He said it the way a man says something he has arrived at on his own, without acknowledging the argument that persuaded him, which was presumably the debt summary she had placed on his desk the previous week, with the payment schedule attached. Beatrice accepted his announcement with professional grace and returned to the counter. She wrote to her old colleague Harriet Alderman in Chicago that week, and in the letter she described Caldwell with more warmth than she had expected to feel toward it, and she mentioned, briefly and without emphasis, that she had met someone who was worth knowing, and she knew that Harriet would read between those careful lines and smile. September arrived and brought with it a cooling of the air that was different from anything Beatrice had known in the city, a cleanness to it, a spaciousness, as though the sky had expanded to let the season in properly. The cattle drives wound down, and the cowboys who had spent the summer in Caldwell began to disperse south for the winter, back to their outfits or their winter employment, and the town exhaled into its quieter self. The Dunbar outfit settled their accounts and paid out their hands in the second week of September. Robert Wells stayed. He had taken a room at the Caldwell Hotel, had hired himself to 2 local ranchers through the winter as a hand who knew what he was doing, and he was in no apparent hurry to go anywhere. They had fallen into a habit that neither of them had formally established, which was the most honest kind of habit. Sunday mornings, Beatrice rode old Clara out onto the prairie east of town, into the tall grass country where the land swelled and rolled in long, gentle undulations, and the sky was so large it felt like standing inside a painting. She had been doing this since her second week in Caldwell, alone and content. In the third week of September, she arrived at the livery stable to find Robert Wells already there, Prospect saddled and ready, and she had looked at him with an expression that asked the question without the words. "I thought the Eastern Range this morning," he said, "unless you prefer to ride alone." She had weighed this for a moment with honest deliberation. "The Eastern Range," she said. They rode out together into the morning, into the tall grass that whispered and bent in the early wind, and they talked sometimes and were quiet sometimes, and the quiet was as good as the talking, which told her something she was not sure she was ready to know. He pointed out a ridge of land to the north where a family of coyotes had their den, and they watched the pups tumble over each other in the early sun. He told her the names the cowboys used for the different kinds of sky over the prairie, storm sky and big sky and river sky, names he had picked up from a Comanche man who had worked briefly with the Dunbar outfit 2 years before. A man named Follows the Creek who had known the land so intimately that his relationship to it seemed like a different category of knowledge than anything Robert had. He was a good man, Robert said. He had been pushed off land his family had lived on for generations by agreements that were not worth the paper they were printed on. He said it with a directness that she appreciated, the acknowledgement that the world they were living in had been built on injustice that was still ongoing, rather than the willful blindness she had encountered in many men who preferred not to examine the foundations. "My father used to say the land belonged to whoever could make the most use of it," Beatrice said. "I disagreed with him when I was a child, and I disagree more firmly now. What would you say it belongs to?" "I would say belonging is a complicated question, and that the simplest approach is to be honest about the history and to not pretend it says something different from what it does." She paused. "But I suppose that is a very Chicago answer." "It is a good answer from anywhere." October came golden and bright, and with it something Beatrice had not planned for, which was the simple, irreducible fact that she was happier than she had been in a long time. She was good at her work. The Hooper accounts were in order, and she had begun to take on private bookkeeping clients from among the other merchants, a side arrangement that Hooper could not legally object to, and that was building her a small but meaningful financial independence. She had a room she had made comfortable with a quilt Agnes had helped her choose, and 2 books she had ordered from a supplier in Kansas City. She had Sunday mornings on the prairie. She had friends she had not expected to make. And she had Robert Wells, who was her friend in the particular way that a person is your friend when they understand the actual shape of you and find it agreeable rather than threatening. He brought her a copy of the Kansas City newspaper when the stage came through because she had mentioned missing access to news. He remembered that she took her coffee without sugar and did not offer it regardless of what everyone else at the table was doing. He asked her opinion on practical matters and received her answer without the flinching surprise that many men exhibited when a woman offered a direct, substantive view. He did not pressure her in any way. He did not make her feel the low-level anxiety of being watched for signs of softening, as though her company were a negotiation rather than a pleasure. He was simply there, steady and honest and funny in a dry way that crept up on her, and she was simply there too, and the space between them was comfortable and uncomplicated. Until November, when it became complicated in the most honest and uncomplicated way. It was an evening when they had both been at Mrs. Kimball's restaurant by coincidence, and the weather had turned cold enough outside that neither of them was in a hurry to leave the warmth of the room, and they had stayed talking long after the other customers had gone, until Mrs. Kimball herself came to bank the fire and give them a look that was maternal without being interfering, and they had put on their coats and walked out into the sharp cold of the November night. The stars over Kansas in November were extraordinary, the kind of stars that exist only where there is not enough civilization to drown them out, and they stood on the boardwalk for a moment and looked up, and Beatrice said, "I did not expect to love it here." "But you do," she turned to look at him. His face in the starlight was serious and attentive and near enough that she could see the slight furrow between his brows. "I do," she said. "I am glad," he said. And then, simply and without any kind of performance, he said, "Beatrice, I like you very much." She looked at him for a long moment in the cold, star-bright dark. She had known this was somewhere in the air between them, had been aware of it the way you are aware of weather moving in from the west. She had been deciding what she thought about it. "I am not looking for a husband," she said. It was not a rejection. It was something more honest than that, an explanation of where she stood and why, given to someone she respected enough to be honest with. Robert Wells looked at her steadily and with complete seriousness, and he said, "I am not in any rush either." She stared at him. "I am not asking you for anything you have not offered," he said. "I like your company. I like who you are. I am not interested in changing any of that or hurrying you toward anything you do not want. I just wanted you to know that I think you are extraordinary, and that I am glad to know you, and that whatever shape this is, I am content to let it be that shape." Beatrice stood in the November cold of Caldwell, Kansas in the year 1878 and felt something open up in her chest like a window in a room that had been closed too long. She said, "I like you very much too, Robert Wells." He smiled. The full smile, the one that reached his eyes. "Good," he said. "That is enough for now." They walked back to the hotel together and said good night at the door, and Beatrice went up to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and put her face in her hands and thought, with a thoroughness she brought to all important subjects, about what she actually felt and what she actually wanted, rather than what she had decided in advance she should feel and want. What she felt was that Robert Wells was the most genuinely good person she had met in years, possibly ever. What she wanted was more of the particular quality of the evenings they spent talking, more of the Sunday mornings on the prairie, more of the sense that she was entirely herself, and that was entirely enough. She had told herself for so long that marriage was a trap, a contraction, a form of slow erasure, that she had stopped examining whether the thing she feared was marriage itself or the particular kind of marriage she had witnessed. What Robert Wells represented, in his patient, unhurried, genuinely curious regard, was something she had not factored into her original model. She did not resolve it that night. She simply let it sit, the way you let a complicated calculation rest while your mind works on it below the surface. Winter settled over Caldwell with a seriousness it had not shown in autumn. December brought snow, real snow, the kind that came horizontal off the prairie and turned the main street white by morning, and the town contracted into its indoor self, the saloon busier on cold evenings, the hotel restaurant full at every meal with people who wanted warmth and company. Robert was working one of the local ranches through the winter, helping to keep the cattle from wandering into trouble in the snow, and the work was harder than trail driving in certain ways because the cold was relentless and the cattle were anxious. He came into town on Saturdays, face reddened from the wind, and they had supper at Mrs. Kimball's and talked about everything. He told her about the Cherokee Strip land in December, about how he had visited it briefly in the fall before the winter set in, and how it had looked in the cold, clear light with the frost on the grass. She listened to the way his voice changed when he talked about it, and she thought about what it would be like to stand on 40 acres of your own, land you had earned with years of work and intention, and to look out at it and know it was yours. "When you build the house," she said, "where will it face?" He looked at her with the particular attentiveness of someone who has been asked the right question. "East," he said without hesitation, "to catch the morning light." "That is what I would choose too," she said. In January, Gerald Hooper made his final mistake, which was attempting to use the structure of their professional relationship as leverage in a way that crossed so far over the line that Beatrice did not have to be subtle about her response. He had told her that her additional private bookkeeping clients were creating a conflict of interest, and that she would have to choose between them and her position at the store. It was nonsense on its face, as there was no actual conflict, and they both knew it. What it was, in fact, was an attempt to remind her that he controlled her primary income, and that this made him powerful in a way he expected her to feel. Beatrice went home that evening and spent 2 hours with a piece of paper and her accounts, and by the time she was done, she had determined that her private clients now paid her nearly enough to cover her expenses without the Hooper salary. Not quite, but almost. She slept on it, and in the morning she went to the store before Hooper arrived, and she opened the books, and she finished the quarterly summary she had been working on, and she left it on his desk with a note that said his accounts were in excellent order, and that she was giving 1 month's notice in accordance with their agreement. She did not give him a reason in the note because she did not owe him one. She told Robert about it over supper that evening, and he said, "How does it feel?" "Terrifying," she admitted. "And right. Both can be true at once," he said. She looked at him across the small table with the lantern between them casting its yellow warmth, and she thought with sudden and uncomplicated clarity that she loved him. Not the soft, vague fondness she had tried to categorize it as for months, but the real thing, the thing that reorganizes your priorities without asking permission. She did not say it. It was January in Caldwell, Kansas, and she had just given her notice at her primary job, and it was not the moment. But she knew it, and knowing it changed the quality of everything, the way the season changes when the light shifts in the morning. The month's notice passed. Hooper received her departure with a bad grace that she found completely unsurprising and entirely untroubling. The store had a good enough reputation, and the accounts were clean enough now that he could find another arrangement, and his personal feelings about her departure were entirely his own problem. She had 4 private clients by February, and a 5th who approached her in the second week of the month, a rancher named Jim Castleton, who had been told by 3 separate people that Beatrice Bristol was the best bookkeeper in the county. She met with Jim Castleton in the hotel restaurant and heard about the state of his ranch accounts and agreed to take him on, and by the time she left the meeting her income was comfortably stable. The fear she had expected from independence had not materialized. What she felt instead was something that had been building since the moment she stepped off that stagecoach, a sense of herself as someone who had made the right decision and was building something real. February also brought a storm that shut the town down for 3 days, the worst of the winter, snow driving in from the northwest with a fury that turned the windows white and made the world beyond the glass invisible. The ranch hands who had been in town for Saturday had not made it back out, and the hotel was full and warm, and the storm created a kind of enforced intimacy among the people sheltering in it. On the first evening of the storm, the hotel guests gathered in the restaurant because it was the warmest room and Mrs. Kimball had made a stew that she kept hot on the stove. And people helped themselves and found seats where they could, and the room had the quality of a place that has been unexpectedly turned into a community. Agnes was there, and Dorothy Graves, and two of the ranch hands from Castleton Spread, and Robert Wells, who had come into town for supplies the day before the storm and found himself pleasantly trapped. He sat beside Beatrice, which was by now a natural arrangement that no one remarked on, and they played cards with Agnes and a rancher named Pete Morrison until late in the evening, while the storm roared outside and the lanterns burned warm and steady inside. And it was one of the loveliest evenings Beatrice could remember in her adult life. When the others had gone to bed and Mrs. Kimball had banked the fire, Beatrice and Robert sat by the last of the warmth, and she said what she had been carrying since January. "I love you," she said. She said it with the same directness she brought to complicated account discrepancies, because it was true and it deserved to be said honestly. "I wanted you to know because I think you should know things that are true and relevant. I'm still not certain what I want to do about it, and I am not asking you for anything specific, but I thought I should tell you." Robert Wells looked at her for a long, quiet moment. Outside, the storm howled and the building shuddered slightly against it. "I love you too," he said. "I have for some time." "How long?" "Since the church social in August," he said. "You were arguing with Pete Morrison about whether the Abilene cattle market was finished as a viable destination. And you were completely right, and you knew it, and you made your point with a precision that I found entirely overwhelming." She laughed, which she had not expected to do in this moment. "That is a very specific thing to love someone from. I am a specific person." She reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand, and he held it with a steadiness that was entirely his. And they sat together while the storm raged outside, and she thought that she had spent so many years being careful about the perimeter around her heart, and she had not imagined that the way through it would be someone who simply stood outside it patiently, making no demands, until she opened it herself. The storm broke on the third morning, leaving Caldwell buried and glittering in the thin winter sun, and Robert Wells hired himself and Pete Morrison's team for 2 days to dig out the road between the town and the outlying ranches, because there were people isolated who needed supplies. Beatrice organized the supply coordination from the hotel, working with Mrs. Kimball to put together packages for the families who had been cut off, and she helped load the wagons with a pragmatic physical efficiency that made Robert smile when he looked over at her from across the yard. Spring came to Caldwell gradually and then all at once, the way it does on the prairie, tentatively in March and then with a great unstoppable green exuberance in April. And with the spring came the anticipation of another cattle drive season, and with that came a conversation that Beatrice had been thinking about for some time. They were riding east one Sunday morning in late March, into the grass that was just beginning to show its color, when she said, "Tell me about the land again." He did, with the same love in his voice that had been there in October. He told her about the river bend that defined the eastern edge of the property, and the ridge that caught the morning light, and the cottonwood grove near the water that would provide shade in summer. "The house," she said. "You have been thinking about building it this spring. I have the materials mostly planned, pine and limestone. The limestone comes out of the creek bed." He looked at her. "Are you thinking about it too?" "I have been thinking about it since January," she admitted. He reined Prospect to a gentle halt. Beside him, old Clara stopped obligingly, and Beatrice turned to face him in the spring morning. "Beatrice," he said, "I told you I was not in any rush. I meant it and I still mean it. But I love you, and I want to spend my life with you, and if you want that too, I would be honored beyond what I can express to build that house east-facing, and to have you in it." She looked out at the spring prairie for a long moment, at the grass and the sky, and the particular light that she had come to think of as hers, the morning light of a place she had not expected to love and had loved completely. "I have spent a very long time being afraid of the wrong thing," she said. "I was afraid of marriage, but what I was actually afraid of was becoming invisible, of bending myself so small that the woman I was got lost in the accommodation." She looked at him. "You have never made me feel any version of that, not once." "I would not know how," he said simply. "You are the best version of yourself, and the best version of you is who I want to be with." "Then yes," she said. "Robert Wells, yes." He reached across and took her hand on the reins, and old Clara snorted her opinion of the pause in their progress, and they rode back toward town together with the spring light on the grass all around them, and the kind of happiness that comes from something being exactly what it is supposed to be. The wedding was in May, organized with the practical efficiency of two people who had the same view on what mattered. They were married by the Methodist minister on a Saturday afternoon, with Agnes and Mrs. Kimball and Dorothy Graves and Jim Castleton and Pete Morrison, and 20 other people from the town who had gathered, because the town liked both of them and wanted to mark the occasion. Beatrice wore her good blue dress with a white lace collar that Agnes had added as her wedding gift, and she carried wildflowers from the prairie, because she had gone out that morning and picked them herself, and they seemed more honest than anything from a florist's box. Robert wore his best coat and a white shirt, and he looked at her when she came through the door of the church hall with an expression that she knew she would keep in her memory for the rest of her life. The minister's words were brief and sincere. The vows they said to each other were the ones in the prayer book, but they had added a line of their own, which they had written together the previous evening sitting at the hotel restaurant table with a piece of paper and 2 opinions about words. The line was, "I will see you fully and I will be glad of what I see. After the ceremony, Mrs. Kimball produced a supper that was a genuine achievement of Western cooking, and Pete Morrison played the fiddle, and Agnes danced with everyone who asked her, and the evening had the particular quality of a celebration that is entirely for the people inside it, unconcerned with anyone's opinion from outside. They spent that first night at the hotel, in the room on the south side of the second floor that was still quieter than the north, and Beatrice lay awake in the comfortable dark for a while, listening to the sound of Robert sleeping and the sound of the prairie through the open window, and thought that she was not, in the smallest or largest sense, afraid. They set out for the Cherokee Strip 2 days later, with a wagon packed with what they needed and Prospect tied behind, and old Clara acquired from a cheerful Mr. Garrett for a fair price, because Beatrice had established that Clara was the right horse for her, and she intended to keep her. The Cherokee Strip was not yet formally open to non-Indian settlement, in the full sense that the land runs would eventually create, but Robert had a legal lease arrangement on the land that he had established through legitimate means, and they were going there with clear eyes about the complexity of their position on land whose history went back far longer than the piece of paper in Robert's coat pocket. The drive to the property took 2 days, and they arrived in the early morning of the 3rd day, in the gold light that Beatrice had heard Robert describe so many times that she had built a picture of it in her mind, and the picture she had built was not as good as the reality. The reality was grassland rolling toward a ridge that caught the first light like a blade held up, and a cottonwood grove bent companionably over a creek that ran clear and quick with the spring water, an air that smelled of the earth waking up, and a sky so large it required a moment to take it in. "This is it," Robert said, from the wagon seat beside her. "This is it," Beatrice agreed, and she felt it, the truth of a place that was going to be home. They built the house through the spring and summer, with Robert doing the framing and the heavy work and Beatrice doing the planning and the precision work, and both of them doing everything in between. 2 men from a neighboring property helped for 2 weeks in exchange for help with their own building later, and by the end of June the walls were up and the roof was on, and by August the house was livable, simple and solid, east-facing, with a window in the kitchen that caught the morning light exactly as planned. Beatrice kept her bookkeeping clients. She had arranged it before leaving Caldwell, that she would continue to manage the accounts of Jim Castleton and two other clients by correspondence and quarterly visits, and this arrangement provided an income that contributed meaningfully to the establishment of the ranch, while Robert put his savings into the cattle and the land. She was also learning everything she could about the ranch itself. She had grown up with a facility for numbers and an education that had not included animal husbandry or agricultural management, but she had always been the kind of person who learned what she needed to know, and by the end of their first summer, she understood the basic rhythms of the land and the cattle with a competence that continued to grow. The autumn of 1879 was their first full harvest of a year on the land, and it was difficult and satisfying in equal measure. The cattle had done well through the summer. Robert had 30 head now, small by any large ranch's standard but real and growing. The garden Beatrice had put in beside the kitchen produced beans and squash and potatoes that she preserved through September in a methodical campaign that left the root cellar full, and her hands rough from work she had never done before and found she loved. One evening in October, sitting on the porch they had added to the front of the house because the evenings were worth watching from a seat, Beatrice said, "I want to tell you something." He turned from the sunset. His face was familiar to her now in every light and expression, and she knew the particular quality of his attention when she was about to say something important. "I believe I am expecting a child," she said. He was still for a moment in the way that meant he was taking something in completely rather than partially. Then he reached out and took her hand, and she felt the slight tremble in his fingers that told her more than words would have. "Are you well?" he asked first, which was the right question. "I am very well," she said. "I am more well than I have been in my life." He brought her hand up and pressed it to his cheek, and he held it there, and neither of them said anything more for a while, because there was nothing that needed to be said that the evening was not already saying for them. The winter of 1879 and into 1880 was hard on the body but warm in the house, and Beatrice managed it with her usual pragmatic competence, continuing her bookkeeping correspondence, managing the household accounts, and reading everything she could find about the practical realities of what was coming. Dorothy Graves, who had left Caldwell in the fall to teach at a school near them and had become a true and dear friend, came to stay in the spring to help, and Agnes Whitmore came too, and the women of the territory looked after each other across distances that would have seemed impossible to manage in a city. The baby arrived on a morning in April of 1880, when the grass was coming up green and the cottonwoods were budding along the creek, in the east-facing house with the window open to let in the spring air, with Dorothy Graves present and competent and entirely unflappable. It was a boy, Robert's son, born on the Kansas prairie, and he was healthy and loud, and had his father's dark hair, and what Beatrice was fairly certain was her own very determined expression. They named him William James Wells, after Robert's father and Beatrice's grandfather, and William arrived into the world and immediately set about making his opinion of it clear. Robert held his son for the first time that afternoon, sitting in the chair by the window in the light they had built the house to catch, and the look on his face was something Beatrice memorized the way she had memorized the look he gave her walking into the church on their wedding day. Because there are moments that a person stores against the possibility of needing to remember what it felt like to be entirely happy. The years after William built themselves one on another with the pleasurable industry of a life being made. The ranch grew. Robert added cattle and a second horse, and eventually a small operation that could sustain itself through the year. Beatrice's bookkeeping practice grew too, because word traveled on the frontier, and people knew by reputation that she was honest, precise, and capable of explaining financial situations in terms that made sense to people who were not naturally inclined toward numbers. She continued to use her own name professionally, Beatrice Bristol, because she had built that professional reputation under that name and it was hers, and Robert had offered no objection whatsoever, which she had expected and appreciated nonetheless. William grew from a loud, healthy baby into a loud, healthy toddler, with an absolute conviction that everything within his reach belonged to him, including Prospect, who was patient with his small visitor in a way that suggested the old trail horse had decided to extend his professional accommodations to a new generation. Agnes Whitmore came to visit in the summer of 1882 and stayed for 2 weeks, and in those 2 weeks she and Jim Castleton, who came by to have Beatrice review his ranch accounts, talked on 4 separate occasions, and by the end of the second week Jim Castleton had asked Agnes if he could write to her, and Agnes had said yes with a directness that Beatrice found very satisfying. They were married in the spring of 1883, and Beatrice wore the same blue dress with the white lace collar to the wedding that she had worn to her own, and Agnes cried and looked beautiful, and Jim Castleton looked at his wife the way a man looks at a fact that has reorganized his entire understanding of what was possible. Their daughter was born in the winter of 1882, early December, before the big snows came, and she was called Margaret after Robert's mother. Margaret arrived quieter than her brother, with an observational intensity that reminded Beatrice disconcertingly of herself at an age she could not actually remember, but assumed she had been similar. William, who was 2 years old, received his sister with a wariness that resolved within a week into a proprietary pride that was entirely his father's manner. The homestead settled into the rhythms of a family living an unromantic, genuinely difficult, genuinely rich life on the Kansas prairie. There were hard seasons and good seasons. There were cattle lost to storms and cattle born in spring sunshine. There was a summer when the grass burned dry and they worried, and a year when the prices at market were so good that they were able to add a proper barn that did not shake in the north wind. Beatrice's bookkeeping had by 1883 become a practice that served 11 clients across 3 counties, and she had arranged her schedule so that she could manage it without compromising the ranch or the children. Robert managed the land with a quiet competence that was more confidence than effort, because he had learned the land the way he had always learned things, completely and patiently. The conversations they had were still the best part of any day. They talked about everything, about the politics of Washington that reached the frontier in newspaper columns weeks after the fact, about the continuing injustices of land policy toward the Indian peoples of the territory, about the future of the cattle business as the railroad expanded and the economics shifted, about the children and what they were growing toward. William showed his father's patience and his mother's precision, a combination that expressed itself in a child who would spend an entire afternoon figuring out how something worked before attempting to do it, and who was unfazed by failure in the way of someone who has understood from the beginning that the process is the point. By the time he was 5, he was following Robert around the ranch with a seriousness that made both his parents laugh with the particular laughter of people who recognize themselves in someone they love. Margaret was different, which was entirely right. She had Beatrice's facility with numbers and Robert's gift for silence, but she had something else that neither of them had, a directness in her social intelligence that made her the instinctive center of any group she found herself in. At 2 or at 4, she simply understood the emotional landscape of a room in a way that seemed to require no particular effort. In the spring of 1884, on a morning that had started like any other morning, Robert came in from the early feeding and poured himself coffee and sat at the kitchen table while Beatrice finished a column of figures for Jim Castleton's quarterly accounts, and he said, "I want to show you something." They rode out after breakfast, leaving William in the capable care of Dorothy Graves, who had become a more or less permanent presence in their lives since her school had been absorbed into a larger district 2 years earlier, and Margaret in the basket chair on the porch, where she preferred to conduct her morning observations. He took her to the far eastern edge of the property, to the ridge she had heard described before she ever saw it, the ridge that caught the first light. They rode up it and stood at the top and looked out at the grassland rolling away in every direction under the spring sky. "When we first came here," he said, "this was what I saw. I wanted you to see it too." "I have been here before," she said, smiling. "Not on a morning this clear, and not knowing what I know now." She looked at him. The sun was fully up, the prairie golden and green below them, the sky the enormous honest blue of a Kansas spring morning. "What do you know now?" she asked. "That this is everything I wanted it to be," he said. "All of it. The land, the house, the family, the life." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear that the wind had pulled loose, and his hand stayed at her jaw for a moment. "I used to think the land was what I was building toward. I understand now that the land is just the place where we live." Beatrice looked at this man she had chosen, who had let her choose him in her own time and her own way, who had stood outside the perimeter she had built around herself with his hat in his hand, and his steady eyes and his absolute willingness to let her be exactly who she was. And she thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, with a leather satchel and a loaded derringer, and a stubborn conviction that the best life was the one you built without compromising yourself into invisibility. She had been right about that. She had simply not known that it was possible to build it with someone standing beside you. "I was so certain I knew what I did not want," she said. "I had the list memorized. I had the reasons for every item on it. They were good reasons." "They were," he agreed. "What I had not factored in," she said, "was you specifically. You were not on the list of possibilities. I am glad to have been an unexpected variable." She laughed, the real laugh, the one that surprised her and arrived without permission. He smiled the smile that still reached his eyes after 6 years of being the thing she measured other smiles against. "I love you, Robert Wells," she said. "I love you, Beatrice Bristol," he said, with equal and deliberate formality. And then he kissed her on the top of the ridge in the spring morning, with the prairie spread out in every direction below them and the sky enormous above them. And there was not a single thing in any direction that was not exactly as it should be. They rode back in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that is full rather than empty, and pulled up at the house to find Dorothy Graves on the porch with both children, William demonstrating something with a stick to his sister's patient attention, and Margaret looking up when the horses came into the yard with an expression of such calm, certain pleasure that Beatrice felt her chest fill with something she did not try to name, because it was too large for a single word. She swung down from old Clara, who accepted her dismount with the practiced tolerance of a horse who had been many places and found them all roughly equivalent, and gathered Margaret up and settled her on her hip, and the little girl pointed at the ridge they had just come down from with one deliberate finger and looked at her mother with a question in her face. "The top of the hill," Beatrice said. "Your father showed me the view." "Good view?" Margaret asked, with the gravity of a 3-year-old asking something important. "The best view," Beatrice said. William abandoned his stick demonstration and came to hang on his father's arm as Robert dismounted, and Robert swung him up onto his shoulders with the easy strength of a man who had spent his life in physical work. And William shouted with delight at the altitude, and the sound of it went out over the prairie and the spring grass and the cottonwoods by the creek and up into the endless sky above the ridge. That evening, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Beatrice and Robert sat on the porch in the spring dark, in the chairs they had made the habit of ending their days in, with cups of coffee that were cooling between their hands. The stars over the Kansas prairie were out in their full extravagance, the way they got on clear spring nights, the Milky Way a river of light across the black. "I have been thinking," Beatrice said. "Tell me. I want to write something, not for clients, for myself." She had been turning this over for months, the sense that she had a perspective on what she had lived, on what women in her position navigated and managed and endured and sometimes triumphed over, that was worth the effort of language. "I do not know exactly what shape it would take." But I think there is something worth saying about the practical and legal realities of women's financial independence in the territory, and I believe I have enough experience to say it with some authority. He was quiet in the way that meant he was thinking about it seriously. A pamphlet, an article, perhaps both. Eventually, she looked up at the stars. Agnes was telling me last spring that there are women in Wichita who have been organizing around property rights. The laws here are different from the East in some ways, more open, and yet the practice is often worse than the law allows because no one knows what the law actually says. You know what it says? I do, she said. And I know how to make numbers tell a story, which is not entirely different from making words tell one. Then you should write it, he said, simply and completely, the way he said things that he meant without qualification. She turned her head to look at him in the starlight, this man who had been her unexpected variable, her patient companion, the person who had built a house east-facing because that was the right direction for the light, who had never once suggested that any version of who she was should be different from what it was. You never doubted it, she said. Not when I left Hooper's without another position secured, not when I said I wanted to keep my professional name, not any of it. Why would I doubt it? You are better at reading a situation than anyone I have ever met. He looked at her with the steady brown eyes that she had looked into across a table in a crowded restaurant in Caldwell 7 years before. I am not in the business of standing between you and what you can do, Beatrice. I never was. She reached over and took his hand, and held it, and the night settled around them with the deep quiet of land that has been lived on and cared for, the creek making its small sound at the edge of hearing, the horses moving in the barn with their comfortable nighttime sounds, the stars burning overhead in their great indifferent beauty. She thought about the woman on the stagecoach. She thought about the letter in her pocket and the derringer in her boot and the stubborn set to her jaw. She thought about how certain she had been that the life she was protecting herself toward was the right one, and how right she had been about the essential thing, which was that she would not bend herself invisible for anyone. She had simply not known how much space there was in the right life for two people who each took up the full amount of room they required. "Do you know what I think?" she said. "Tell me." "I think that girl on the stagecoach was right about almost everything," she said. She was just working with incomplete information. What information was she missing? Beatrice squeezed his hand and looked up at the Kansas stars and said, "That you were out there." The night held them there on the porch of the east-facing house in the Cherokee Strip for a long time after that, the two of them and the dark and the stars, and the sound of the prairie in the small, warm hours of an ordinary, extraordinary evening, until the coffee was entirely cold, and the spring air had begun to tip toward the deeper chill of midnight, and Beatrice stood and stretched and offered her hand. "Come to bed," she said. He rose and took her hand, and they went inside, through the house they had built with their own work and intention, past the room where William slept with the covers kicked to one side the way he always did, past the smaller room where Margaret lay on her back with her arms out like a starfish, past the shelf in the hallway where Beatrice kept 3 account books, and the first draft of what was going to become a pamphlet on women's property rights in the Kansas Territory. Past the kitchen with the window that caught the morning light, and into the room at the east end of the house that was theirs. Tomorrow the ranch would need the work it always needed. The accounts of 11 clients would require the attention she always gave them. William would need breakfast, and Margaret would need to be collected from her morning post on the porch. Old Clara would require her opinion to be consulted about the pace of the day. The land they lived on would do the work that land does, quietly and without asking anything, but that they stay attentive to it. All of that was tomorrow. Tonight was the star-filled dark and the house they had built, and the children sleeping, and the life that was entirely, recognizably, ferociously their own. Beatrice Bristol Wells, who was still entirely Beatrice Bristol in the ways that mattered, turned out the lamp and listened to the prairie breathe through the open window, and was, with a completeness that required no qualification, entirely content. The years continued to add themselves to the life of the Wells homestead the way good years do, quietly and with purpose. The pamphlet Beatrice wrote in the winter of 1884 was distributed through 3 counties by the spring, and 2 women in Wichita who were organizing around property rights for married women in the territory wrote to her after reading it, and she wrote back, and those letters became a correspondence that would outlast the decade. Robert expanded the cattle operation steadily, buying adjacent acreage when it became available, and by 1886 the ranch was a real working spread with 30 head of cattle and the reputation of a man who ran his land carefully and fairly. He hired 2 hands, brothers named Louis and Carlos, raised from the old vaquero tradition of South Texas, who knew cattle with the instinctive expertise of men who had grown up in that knowledge. And the ranch ran with a smoothness that reflected the combined competence of everyone on it. William, by the time he was 7, was a fixture of the morning work, following Louis and Carlos with the determined absorption of a child who has decided he is going to learn something. And Louis, who was a patient teacher, gave him the kind of real information rather than child-safe approximations that William's earnestness demanded, and that he rewarded with genuine application. Margaret, at 5, had begun to read with a speed and appetite that delighted Beatrice and did not surprise her at all, and Dorothy Graves, who had settled permanently in the area and was teaching the small local school that served the ranch families of the Strip, reported that Margaret's reading was 2 years ahead of where it needed to be, and her arithmetic was approaching the same territory. "She is going to drive her teachers mad," Dorothy told Beatrice over tea one Sunday. "She is going to be her own teachers," Beatrice said. In the spring of 1887, a 3rd child arrived. Another boy, born in March, named Thomas after no one in particular, except that it was the right name for him, and he arrived with a disposition that was sunny without being simple, smiling at everyone who appeared in his field of vision with a democratic generosity that made the whole household slightly more optimistic. Robert held Thomas the afternoon of his arrival and looked at Beatrice across the room with an expression that had not changed substantially from the one she had memorized in the east-facing chair with William 7 years before, and she loved him for that consistency, for the way the accumulation of years had deepened rather than diminished what was between them. "We are a considerable enterprise," Robert said, looking from Thomas to William, who was hovering in the doorway with the responsible gravity of a firstborn, to the sound of Margaret reading to Dorothy in the next room. "We are," Beatrice agreed from the pillow. "Are you happy?" he asked. It was the question he asked, not with any anxiety behind it, not as a performance, but because he was genuinely curious about how she was at any given moment, because he had always been genuinely curious about how she was, from the first evening in the restaurant when he had looked at her working through account books at the supper table, and decided that was interesting rather than strange. She looked at the room around her, at the morning light coming through the east window, at the man across the room holding their newest child, at the sound of her other children in the next room, at the spread of her bookkeeping papers on the corner table where she would return to them when she was ready, at the view through the window of the land they had built together on the rolling Kansas prairie. "I am," she said, "more than I knew how to want when I was first learning what I wanted." He came to sit beside her, Thomas still in his arms, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and the morning light fell across all 3 of them. And outside the window the prairie was green with another spring, and the cottonwoods down at the creek were in their full soft leaf, and the cattle were moving in the pasture, and Louis was calling something in Spanish to Carlos near the barn, and old Clara, retired now to a life of well-deserved ease in the south pasture, lifted her head and looked at something in the middle distance with the tranquil authority of a horse who has always known exactly where she stands. There was nothing unfinished. There was nothing left in the air. There was the land, and the house, and the family, and the work, and the long, reliable companionship of two people who had found each other unexpected and chosen each other deliberate, and had gone on choosing, through seasons and difficulty and ordinary days and extraordinary mornings, in the full and permanent knowledge that the life they were living was entirely, exactly their own,